Okay, everybody. So we've moved on from the classical era, which ends with Beethoven. He sort of bookends the classical era and starts the romantic era of music. If you asked him at the time, he wouldn't be like, yes, my intention was to start this brand new movement, this um, philosophical, ideological, musical movement. No, he was just writing music. It's what he was writing music how he felt. Um, but anyway, I'll explain kind of how he planted the seeds for the Romantic era. Okay, Beethoven's symphonies, especially his sixth and fifth, sought to tell a story. This is extremely crucial, right? So he wanted to tell a story, and he was not so concerned. He started being less concerned with following sonata allegro form, right, which we talk about. You start with stability, the beginning of the song. We move to a sort of tonal conflict. That maybe another theme is introduced, right? The tonal conflict is developed for a while, and then eventually you go back to the beginning thematic material, and the conflict is resolved at the end. That's basically the formula of all these classical pieces of music that we listen to, Haydn and all of that, um, Handel. But things are starting to change with Beethoven. Okay. Um, Unlike many of his predecessors, right, Beethoven goes to tell stories. He has to convince symphony houses to put his music on. He didn't have patrons like his predecessors. He didn't have the Esterhazy family like Mozart. He wrote 9 symphonies, right? He famously goes deaf towards the end of his life. They don't know why he went deaf. They've never exhumed Beethoven's body, which is buried, I think, in Austria still. I mean, it's probably all decomposed or whatever, but they never tried to figure out what was wrong with him. He's deaf. He goes deaf, and he sawed off the legs of his piano so he could lay on the floor. As you know, he had a little bit of hearing. Um, he would try to feel the vibrations through the floor of his apartment, but eventually he loses all of his hearing. Right. So the 2 symphonies I'm talking about are the Fifth Symphony, which you've probably heard at least the first 4 notes of, and the Sixth Symphony. I'm going to play a couple seconds of each symphony. Feel free to go in and listen to these yourself. Right, so that would be this. They think this is the first movement, right? Already things are starting to get conflicted tonally. There's lots of tension right away. So instead of having this like real cookie cutter piece of music, it's just off to the races with the Fifth Symphony. Oh, nice. We got Beethoven's picture up there. Ah, good. And this is a modern symphony by now, right? In the Romantic era, we have all the instruments basically have been included in the orchestra that we still use in most orchestral pieces nowadays. So Beethoven, by then, was orchestrating in a really modern way. Ah, so awesome. Right, so here we are. We're already on another completely different idea of the melody. So I'm trying to say, instead of taking, you know, one movement 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, 10 minutes here, blah blah blah. Beethoven's just off to the races. He's already kind of shooting from the hip, doing whatever he wants, and it sounds beautiful. It's one of the most famous pieces of music written by humans ever. The second thing I wanted to bring to your attention was his storytelling. Beethoven wanted to tell a story in his Symphony Number 6 about a rain cloud or like a pastoral day, like a beautiful spring day in the countryside. A rain cloud comes, it rains and storms, and then the rain cloud goes away. That's the idea of the Sixth Symphony, which I'll play you a little bit of. Right, so this is the beautiful spring day. It's lovely. It's the countryside. You know, it's pastoral. So this is like the most recognizable theme, right? All right, so if I go to the middle, oh, we got to listen to this a second. Oh, by the way, two trombones hanging out there, right? Oh, it's the modern orchestra. Sixth Symphony, by the time the Sixth Symphony is written, the trombone is included. Alright, so you get the point. Now, I'm going to go to the middle, and hopefully we'll hear some of the storm, right? Oh, not the storm yet. You hear the trombones playing? Bum, 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 bum. Trombones is like, you know, they're there to bring in the heavy firepower, the heavy artillery. It's a storm. And then at the end, we should hear the recapitulation, right? It sounds nice and beautiful and lovely. Right, here's the end, is the recapitulation. You get the point, all right? So Beethoven really pushes this form a lot in his music, and at the end, you know, all the musicians that come after him in the Romantic era say, yep, Beethoven was the guy who inspired us to change this form a little bit to suit the needs of our storytelling through music. Right? That was a long-winded way to say that. The Romantic era lasts from 17-ish 80 to, I mean, this is wrong, from 1820 to 1910. These are approximate dates, right? Musicians of the Romantic era were trying to tell stories with their music, often called programmatic music, because the story/program would be held in the audience's mind while the orchestra played. The classical tonality was explored to a great length. Composers experimented with new chords and orchestrations in an effort to tell these magnificent stories. Right? Yep, so by now instruments really look and sound a lot like what we're used to. Musicians told stories about all sorts of topics, including tales of great politicians and war fighters, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, ghosts, lovers' trysts, magical enchantments, and eventually mythology and folklore. The mythology folklore-based music became more and more infused with nationalism, or beloved by nationalists towards the end of the era. So 1910, right, what's going on in the world? You know, between this era, there's a lot of political revolution, and at the end, the nationalists take over Europe, and we got World War I, we got World War II. So I just want you to think of, like, this is, you know, towards the end of the Romantic era, we have the nationalist soundtrack sort of being made, and it's because partially the musicians are starting to develop a national style. This happens. Also, some technological innovations of the Romantic era. The Romantic era of music coincides with the Industrial Revolution. People start making, using machines to make products. The entire economy of Europe and America, and really the world, changed pretty drastically. People move from the farms to the cities. Lots of people, more Americans are starting to live more comfortably, but also people feared that the industrialization of building goods would come as a sacrifice for the culture in large. And I want to bring attention to this painting down here of this woman. This is actually an advertisement for something, I don't know, but this was a French advertisement by a man named Marchi. I forget his first name, Albert Marchi or something. I'll look it up. Right, Marchi was a famous painter, but he realized if he made these color lithographs, he could make a lot more money if companies used his art to sell things. So like by now, art is being used to sell products. There's giant smokestacks that litter the cities, right? In the city, there's just factories everywhere. And you also have, some pretty bleak scenes. For example, children working in factories was commonplace. If you were 10 and, you lived in the city, chances are you stopped going to school or you never went to school in the first place and they threw you straight into the factories where it was pretty dangerous. Right, so the real world began to lose its enchanted qualities in some ways. And so Romantic era music was like a hearkening back to that. Something to think about. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some famous composers of the Romantic era, and then I have 6 here. We're going to talk about each one individually. There's certainly a lot more, but I'm going to talk about these 6 for today. Felix Mendelssohn was a German composer, and Mendelssohn, he was a composer when he was very young. He died young, and I would say he's probably most famous for this octet of strings, which I'll play a little bit of you. That's beautiful. I got a little bit enchanted by that. Mendelssohn was Jewish, interestingly. He was born Jewish, but was forced to convert to Christianity because that was the norm at the time in Germany in the 1800s. If you were a composer, they would, or anybody in public in the public face, and you were Jewish, you most likely were forced to convert. Okay. Let's see. The next person I'm going to talk about is Robert Schumann, also died young. Was a German composer, pianist, and influential music critic of the Romantic era. He was a piano player but hurt his hand, I believe. And he also suffered from, so he became a composer instead of a piano player. He also suffered from what was most likely bipolar disorder, or perhaps he was poisoned somehow. They used a lot of dangerous chemicals back in the day in everyday objects, like mercury went into the hat bands that everybody wore, for example. So he had a lot of behavioral and emotional troubles. He but was also a very famous musician. Do I have any of his music up here? I may have accidentally deleted some. He was very famous for writing lieder, which is vocal singing. He would record. He would arrange and write music for German poetry that was very popular at the time. And the poetry was most often like love songs and things like that. I'll leave a couple examples of his lieder, his love songs, and his songs on the Google Classroom. The next person I'm going to talk about is Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt is now known as a composer and teacher, but was very famous for his piano playing back in the day. By the age of 12, Liszt was touring Europe as a concert piano player. After the death of his father in the 1830s, it really affected him emotionally. He moved back home and became a piano teacher, but he continued to compose. And this is one of his compositions played in 1966. It's probably his most famous. It's called Hungarian Rhapsody. So I was talking about the nationalism before, right? This is a Hungarian